Thank you, Martin. And on behalf of the panel and indeed of all of us at the Learning Sciences Institute of Australia, which is at Australian Catholic University, we'd like to acknowledge and thank AARE for the support and the selection. And I look forward to continuing our association with that wonderful organisation at home as well as this one here. I start with two apologies. Claire Wyatt-Smith and Elizabeth Warren, who are members of the team to present, for different reasons can't be here with us. Claire is working with some early career researchers in Hong Kong, and that was a commitment that she had prior to our selection by AARE. And Elizabeth Warren has been beset by a family situation, so her apologies. We do have a video from Elizabeth on her particular work with Indigenous students. So from the two people sitting closest to me, colleagues Clarence Nung and Gina Blackberry, we're going to present some of the work that we've done which shares the cover issue of engagement. And sitting next to Gina is Stephen Elliott, who's flown over from Arizona State University. Stephen is a professorial fellow with us at ACU as well. And Steve's job today is to do a wrap-up, a critique of the presentation. So we've got what's left of 90 minutes to share amongst us. I'm going to step out of the role of chair and into that of first presenter. And my work is, as is Clarence's and Elizabeth Warren's, the work that resulted from an Australian Research Council supported project. Mine, with a partner organisation, Boys Town, looked particularly at the recovery of disaffected youth, youth who, for various reasons, had not fitted well into mainstream education and who ended up knocking at Boys Town's door or being led to Boys Town's door in an attempt to see if they could be recovered and made part of the mainstream of mortgage-paying and tax-paying citizens of Australia. I've adjusted the title a little in behind the colon there to try to capture what I think is the essence of Boys Town, something special. What they do when they're working with their youth holds a number of messages, I think, for we teachers, we educators across the world, in that they're educating people and they use curriculum as a basis for doing that. Just a little bit of context for the people who aren't Aussies in the group. We're a fairly recent European settlement in the Southern Hemisphere. Before we got there in 1788, the first peoples who ranged across what commonly in Australia are called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples, very, very complex set of society, had marvellous traditions of education through the narrative. They spoke, they listened, they learned. And that narrative, in some ways, has not been repeated and rehearsed in the European-style education that took place after the First Fleet landed. And for that reason, perhaps, there's been some disconnect, very much so with the First Peoples and education systems. And you'll see that coming through in the numbers of young people that were in the various studies being reported today from that background. 1788, First Fleet arrived from England, and with it there were many Irish people. There were many folk there who were probably surprised at the strange animals, the different botany of the place, the weather, blue skies, budding footballers, all those sorts of things. Soon after the First Fleet, one of the early governors took particular care when looking at the young people of the colony, and he was interested particularly in the education of girls. He was very worried that girls from the age of from 6 to 16, without education, might fall foul of prostitution, and he didn't want any of that. So he instituted what he called orphan schools, the first schools in the colony of New South Wales. We've done a little bit better since then, but Australia's education system has risen independently across states. So each of the states and then the territories that are not yet states have developed their own systems with federal government support. But by and large, it's not been until very recently that we've brought that all together as a national system of of education and assessment. The sorts of things that have resulted from that evolution look pretty good in the stats. For instance, if you look at the education index, which the UN uses, the basis for calculating that is to look at the number of students eligible for schooling who actually get schooling. And Australia ranks equal first with Ireland and New Zealand and Iceland. The World Atlas puts us pretty high on the batting list in terms of most educated nations. And we've done consistently well in international tests. So that's the backdrop against what we're presenting. Let's start with some of the pressing things on the depressing side. More than 500,000 youngsters between 15 and 24 are unemployed, or they're underemployed in Australia. This is a huge social issue for us. Of youth in our country defined from 15 to 24, as it is in the UK, who are not enrolled in school, have a look at the data that I've got underneath. It's fairly clear that, again, a Western education trend is such that we find those who complete year 12 are more likely to be employed. So the earlier the youth are dropping out of school, the bigger the risk of them being in the unemployed listings. In Victoria, one of our more populous states, we knew that from the data earlier this year that in 2014 there were 10,000 youngsters who left school between years 9 and 11 and didn't go to any other educational training. In addition to that, 6,000 did, but soon dropped out and have been untraceable. So, where are we going with all this? In Australia, we're still working towards a comprehensive action plan. Unlike the Irish National Strategy for Research and Data on Children's Lives and the UK Strategy for Data Resources, only on the 26th of May of this year have we got a national data standards listed that help researchers to look at the comprehensive and focused picture of doing something about the situation that precedes that last entry. So here's the overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with my conclusion, just in case I run out of time, and as chairman I've got to be very careful about that. And we're going to finish with our conclusion. In between we'll look at working with the people at Boys Town and why I consider them to be highly innovative educators. And the three discussion points are about a huge consistency in view that they're able to achieve very quickly after these young people walk through their door with what the staff of Boys Town intend to happen. Secondly, that the changes in their demeanour, their behaviour, their attitude, their aspect of future changes very, very early in that contact. And thirdly, that what results from it is a good news story. Lots of flourishing selves, good literacy increases in terms of measured literacy and their communication and their numeracy, all of which come together to, as I say, help them walk out the door in much better state to be real participants in real ways in Australian society. Okay, so Boys Town had something, and they knew that they were doing fairly well, but decided that they wanted to line up with educational researchers to see if they could to test out what that something was. That led to empirical evidence, which they've been able to compare with their sort of impressionistic view of what it was they were doing. And it's helped them to really put some hard, concrete oomph behind their intention to improve what they're doing. They've also committed to ongoing research with folk from a number of universities in Australia. So the project that I'm going to talk to you briefly was longitudinal. It had quant and qual aspects to it. It had large numbers of students who we followed over about 6.5, 7 years. Staff from the headquarters, from the front line, and from the regional administration of Boys Town. employers of Boys Town's youth, and people that the youth nominated as being significant in their lives. They worked around social enterprises. Do you know, are you familiar with social enterprise stuff? So they looked at what communities, local communities wanted. In some communities were absolutely beset by graffiti, for example. They wanted the graffiti removed, and funding was obtained to do that. Boys Town competed in the open market to win contracts. Didn't win them all, but where they did, they could then get the youth involved in at-work learning about themselves, as well as about their literacy and numeracy and communication. All of them in the sample were people who were chronically unemployed. They had tried and had given up in most cases. So we used the large Likert-type items to help us to get measures on their agency, on their well-being, on decision-making, on choice, a range of things such as that type, as well as interviews with 60 of them who provided case studies for us. For Australians, I apologise. I'm going to develop a wallaby theme through this, with the World Cup being on our doorstep at the moment. That's a very big wallaby. And he's intended to depict being in work there at the moment. Yeah? So at the end of working with Boys Town, these are the results I'm obtaining. Now, these data are very important because other non-government organisations doing similar work are getting far lower numbers in terms of retrieval and re-engagement. I want to talk quickly about the two discriminative functions that we found. By the way, all the analysis, all the data, if you're interested in those, are available at that site that I have on this particular slide. The first discriminative function let us know which of those who came through Boys Town's door were likely to proceed successfully through to the end of training, and which were not. So when I presented to Boys Town the results of about a 7-year study, and said to them, almost 7 out of 10 of your youth are in full-time work at double the national criterion, I looked and there was a silence for a while, and their first response was, "Can you tell us about the other 3? They were very interested in what it was that they needed to do to hook into those who were not being served well by their current function. And so the discriminative analysis helped us to point them in that direction. The second discriminative function showed us that there was a tremendous change for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island youths who'd come to Boys Town. They were very, very overrepresented in the data of having been in contact with juvenile justice, JJ. A lot of them had been in jail. A lot of them were waiting trial and sentencing. But that had changed tremendously by the time that they'd finished their work. The second function said if you wanted to predict the people who were likely to continue offending, then it was a combination of having a prior juvenile justice record, being non-Indigenous and being male. So the outcomes, statistically significant changes in those factors. You can see that perhaps they weren't languishing as our large wallaby is doing at the top, but they were engaging in literacy, and it was literacy about how to mix chemicals to remove graffiti, or what sort of fertile soil you needed to find before planting roses as opposed to eucalypts. This is the mission of Boys Town. And here's what they saw in the data. First, there was a consistency of view across all their own staff. It didn't matter whether the staff was sitting in the chair of the boss of the board or working in the front line with the youth. They were saying the same sorts of things about Boys Town's work. We won't go through the analysis here. This comes from an instrument called Garbeck out of the University of Innsbruck. which is a really nice propositionally based text analytics system. And it's showing us as you can see, the colour coding and the centration of this is all around Boys Town's work. So whether you're at any of those different positions in the hierarchy, working with youth, improving their positions, making sure that improvement had to do with a fullness of well-being rather than just magic for the moment. The Gestalten tree showed that support in the enterprises and helping youth to be independent were the major things that they were looking at. We won't read through this, but this is a reconstruction from the statements of about 70 staff members that show, again, the sort of depiction that we saw recently with the Gestalten work. Here are some examples. I won't talk to these, I'll just flash them for you, of what the staff were saying. Second of 3 points. Soon after starting, the youth were saying things that were so parallel and reflective of what the staff had been saying. There's the Gestalten tree. Trust me, because I'm running out of my 15 minutes. Look at the verbs here. And these were the words, the actual language being used by the youth. And they're, as you know, lexically, the verb is a very powerful indicator of people taking action. And their language became spotted with verbs, where in the first sets of interviews that was unlikely to be the case. What we're reflecting here is the fact that at the end of the interview period, we were getting lots of aspirational information recorded. And there's a side-by-side show of the text analysis of the youth and the staff. Again, the consistency is very high. Third point, as you can see there was satisfaction about what was happening with youth and the staff themselves. Third last slide. When you analyse the statements from staff, you can see the huge number of very positive statements. With the students, same thing. Not quite as high, but their base level was much lower. There's the final analysis. When we put all the data together, we could see that help was being seen as giving and given, as received and appreciated. So again, looking at the mission statement, it seems that the youth were very much aligned to action that had occurred for them, that they'd been able to engage with, that had changed their lives in these ways. Boys Town has since the research changed their induction program to try and capture the 3 of the 10 who hadn't succeeded, according to our data. They've been using the report in their advocacy to state and federal government for funding, and they are using systems for including youth voice throughout the engagement they had that perhaps is it's a much higher level of engagement that they had previously. For research, Boys Town are very readily lining up with us for any of the linkage and discovery grant applications that we put forward that have to do with the retrieval of disaffected youth. And there's our last wallaby. Thank you. Because there are only a few of us, rather than have questions now, I think we'll all speak first and then open up to questions. Eh? So Clarence. My colleague Clarence Ng, who's the leader of one of the 7 programs in the Institute at ACU.
So what I want to share with you today is the research finding from a project that is ongoing. We are in the final year of this research project. What we're really interested in understanding is the notion of reading engagement among disadvantaged students in Australia. So we have a problem in Australia in terms of literacy and especially reading achievement level. So we have done pretty well. This is the PISA testing result in 2012. As with the previous round of PISA, Australia's been ranked really high among the top ranking country. But what I think is really important is to look at the final column, that number there, 318. So larger that number means the gap between the high and low achieving students are really high. And we have a large gap between our performing and less performing students in Australia. And if you look at the data that we have to find out more about why and who these students are, and one of the most important factor is the socio-cultural, socio-economic background. So if you're coming from a rich family, your achievement score in reading is much higher than those students coming from the poor families. And if you are living in the urban area, the chance for you to get a better result is much higher than students who are living in the rural area. If you are non-indigenous, then the chance you're getting better result will be higher. And in the SES status as well. So the chance for students who are in the rural area, indigenous, and from a poor family, their result in the reading test will be poor, in terms of the probability. So there's a gap, but our knowledge about the gap and what has contributed to the gap is very limited. And what we have often seen is this type of expression in our classroom. So students are finding work in the classroom very boring. Right? So if you go into a disadvantaged school and talk to the student asking what's been happening, they will immediately telling you that, oh, the class today is not interesting at all. And when we try to understand more about them, when we talk to them about their reading lesson, and many of them are sharing something similar to what you're seeing here, is the strategies they are using to avoid engaging in reading or to avoid engaging in the activities that the teacher provide them in their classroom. Now the trouble is, how are we going to make sense of this type of behaviors? Now this type of behavior, we have observed them, we have interviewed students, and it's frequently reported in our data set in the past 3 years. So these are something that is really common. If you are a teacher, you probably have come across all these type of behaviors very often in your classroom, that the student is sitting idly, doing nothing, looking out of the class, of the window, little things in the drawer, leaving the books on their lap without reading it. So how are we going to make sense of it? So what we have done is to start with our literature review, and one of the huge literature that we've been looking into is the studies in reading motivation. And if we follow that track and do the research, I think we won't end up with lots of new insight, because when we send the questionnaire out to disadvantaged students asking whether they will be interested in reading in their classroom, and most of them may say, no, we're not interested at all. And then if we follow this paradigm to do our research, we won't get to a lot of new findings. There's another large chunk of literature that looks into avoidance motivation, which is contrasting to approaching motivation. So interest, self-accuracy are approaching type of motivation. You need those to drive you to engage in those activities. But there are studies that looks into avoidance motivation, and we've been thinking whether this type of avoidance motivation may be something that disadvantaged students are using or affecting them often. We also look into the literature that discuss the social influences. So disadvantaged students are coming from poor background, they don't have a lot of resources at home, so when they learn in a different social context. And we need to take that context into understanding of their behavior. And the final chunk of literature that we've been using is student voice. Student voice is about our understanding of these students. So have we ever talked to them? Do we really know what is actually behind their disengagement, or what's actually behind their avoidance behavior? Right? So we put these all together and we call it a person in context perspective. So what we think is important to understand those negative responses, we need to situate those negative responses in that context. So not just the classroom, but also the wider context that these students are coming in and they bring into the classroom. So we designed the READ project, and basically the READ project are trying to understand the factors that contributing to reading avoidance and disengagement, and to understand the teaching practices that may cause it, or the teaching practices that may promote reading engagement, and to develop something to combat these types of negative responses in the classroom. We have 3 studies in the project. What I'm going to share with you today is some findings from the study 1 and study 2. Study 3 is still ongoing. This is a design of the study 1. So we interview students 4 times a year. We observe them 4 times a year. We do qualitative observation. The 4 observations in the middle there, they are systematic observations. We also do survey, and we also interview the teachers. And this is important. You probably wonder why we have such a complicated data collection procedure. Think about these year 5 students. They seldom talk to people. They don't normally articulate their feelings and experiences very openly. It took a long time for us to develop the rapport with them and to get them to feeling confident and comfortable to talk to us. So the participants are mainly coming from the poor schools. We have 2 schools in the rural area, 3 schools in the urban area. They're all performing below the national average. And this is the form that we used to get the teacher to nominate the student for us to be included in our study. And altogether, we have 48 students in our study. And we follow them 3 years. And what I'm going to show you is one of these students that we have been following in the past 3 years. His name is Peter, which is a fabricated name, of course. And what I'm going to show you is the profile. So we put all those information that we have gathered together in the past 3 years, and we try to develop a reader profile. And these are the themes in the reader's profile. I won't be able to show you everything, but what I'm trying to show you is the importance of situating the behaviors within the context. This is the profile in year 5. So we have description, we have evidence. So we draw evidence from within our data set to make sure that anything that we describe the student is being supported by our data set. This is year 6, this is year 7, and this is the teacher assessment. The interesting thing is the teacher assessment is not consistent with what the students are telling us about themselves. Now this is a summary of the profile for Peter. So what you can see here is Peter thinks of himself as a good reader. In year 6, not so a good reader. In year 7, sort of a good reader. So his understanding of himself or identity is deteriorating. In terms of enjoyment, in year 5, he's been talking about how he enjoyed reading Guinness Book of Record. And there's other books that is available for him in school, in the school library, in the classroom library. He will be able to read. In year 6, the only things that interest him is about sinking boat, sinking ship, and he also enjoy listening to the teacher, reading to him about Paul Jennings' book. In year 7, his only interest in reading is rugby. He was the rugby member of the school, and rugby books and magazines are not in the school library, not in the classroom library. If he want to read, he need to go to the council library to get those books and magazines. In terms of valuing, what you can see here is interesting as well. He thinks reading is important. In year 5, the reason he given to us is it's important for job. So think of it, it is year 5 students. It's just too young to have that type of articulation. But anyway, that's what he told us. Then year 6, he's still telling us that reading is important. And the reason he's given is it's important because the words are in the spelling test. And that's why he thinks reading is important. Reading is helping him to get through the other tasks that he was required to do. And in year 7, he still said reading is important, but he said, I don't know. I'm not sure about the reason now. So that is something that is alarming. In terms of concentration, these figures are taken out from the systematic observation. So we have done systematic observation on individual students 3-4 times a year. If it's 100% means the whole time of observation, the student is engaging. Right? So in year 5, group reading is something that is not so engaging for Peter. And the main reason is because he was not very interested in waiting for his turn. He thought all the other students are not doing that well in reading, so he would rather do other things rather than waiting for his turn. Quiet reading is not so engaging because he's been distracted during the quiet reading time for half of the time that he's been distracted. Okay. In terms of support and help, there's limited support that he could get from the teacher. So it is reflected in our interview data, is also in our observation data as well. And one of the things that we have noticed in year 5 is when he was doing the quiet reading, the teacher, who was supposed to read together with the whole class, was actually doing some other thing. So it's not just once that we have observed that type of teacher behavior. It's been repeatedly showing up in our observation record. So the teachers either doing things on his own computer, or teacher is talking to another teacher, or teacher is doing some other personal things, even taking breakfast. So not much support from the teacher, not much support from the friends. Friends is the only source of support, but friends are also a source of distraction as well. In terms of changes that he desired, in year 6, he said he wanted to read more in the class. He wanted the teacher to read them more. And you've been wondering why. The reason why he wanted the teacher to read them more, he didn't like it in year 5. He wanted to read for himself in year 5. But in year 6 and year 6 onward, he always said, I wanted the teacher to read me more. Basically because he thought that would be easier for him to do the reading comprehension worksheet. So if somebody's reading the worksheet for him, he finds it easier to get it through. So this is the summary of the reading motivation. And you can see there's some deteriorating along the way. If we just think of Peter, what we can say is he's getting less motivated to read, right? But if you put that into the context, what you can see here at the bottom, the green boxes are all supporting factors. So supporting factors in year 5 are the reading materials and the activities that Peter's able to get into. In year 6, he still can get into the class library to read books that he's interested in. The teacher's still willing to help and try to make the reading fun. But in year 7, it's gone. So there's no more supportive element. Now, I'm not saying that there's a causal relationship. There's no way that I will be able to establish that causal relationship. But what I'm trying to show you is this Peter, he is getting less and less motivated. And the context that's supporting his reading is also changing. And the support that he will be able to receive from the classroom context is no longer existing. And basically, it is because of change of reading practices in the classroom from basically from enjoyment and interest, a variety of activities, to basically about comprehension and worksheets, right? So I won't be able to, this slide is trying to show you the type of reading environments that Peter is often faced. I won't be able to have time to show it to you, but what I'm trying to show you is that Peter is reading in a really controlling environment. If you look at the second paragraph, the teacher A said, have you finished? It is only 5 minutes into the reading. Then the teacher A asks, have you finished? Right? So it is a lot of pressure to perform, to complete the task. This one's supposed to be funny. I should have select one that Tony Abbott's in it. Most of our British colleagues are not here. But what I'm trying to say is politicians may not really help. In Australia, we've been trying to test our students using national testing, and the national testing is supposed to be supportive of disadvantaged students, isolate the gap, and to provide additional support, right? But since 2008, 7 years onward, the gap is still there, it's persistent. We don't have much change. So what is really an engaging pedagogy? So based on Peter's case, these are something that is very important. You need to have a classroom that is quiet, that is orderly. The teacher needs to be the reading role model. So it's not just trying to organize reading, but also showing the passion for reading, providing high level of support, personalize it, providing them with a chance of collaboration, engaging reading material, which is really important, and develop a sense of purpose. Now, just want to show you very briefly that the survey study, we use the avoidance behavior that we have isolated, and we develop a questionnaire, and we have sent out to the students and try to get them to fill in. And we use SEM to analyze it. This is the 3 types of strategies that we have found. And what we try to do is to link it up with the achievement goals and self-efficacy. And what is showing up here is if the students are focusing on learning, focusing on mastery, focusing on their effort, then their chance of that they're showing those negative behavior will be minimized. Okay? So this is the final one. I think what the message is, we need to find different ways to engage students.
Thanks, Clarence. Clarence's work clearly is to look at the condition and the context in which reading disengagement is happening for children and young people in schools. And along the way, he's mentioned that he saw behaviours from teachers that were a little untoward, and our next speaker has actually followed up on that to talk about teacher disengagement. Gina.
Good morning. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the term disengaged teachers is at best problematic, and it's by no means meant to offend anyone. I would like to encourage conversation around the term. But it is something that we felt needed to be acknowledged. It was certainly something that became quite apparent in the data. And as such, we need to have a conversation around it. So the data that I'm going to be speaking about this morning comes from study 3 that Clarence referred to in the READ project, study 2 in the READ project. And so that was a longitudinal study. There were 49 students involved in that in the 3rd year of the study. So at that stage, those students were in year 7. And what we were drawing on interview and observations predominantly to obtain the data. And what we found was, in the observations, this sort of thing was happening in the classroom with these disengaged students. So those of you who are familiar with being in a classroom would recognise a lot of these behavioural traits. And in the course of conversations with the colleagues that were collating this data, the frequency with which we were seeing this became very obvious. And so it necessitated us digging a little bit deeper in order to understand what was going on for these students. And that's where the student voice came into this project. We were at pains to converse with the students and to ask them what was going on for them. So not only behaviourally, but cognitively and effectively. I'd like to read a couple of excerpts from one student and what she had to say. The first excerpt: "If I don't wear glasses, I get headaches which stop me from learning and reading, but the teacher has no idea I wear them. I get teased when I do, but she wouldn't care. Well, she might care, but she wouldn't do anything about it." And the second, from the same student: "She only works with our group about once every 2 weeks. Every time I tell my teacher he, another student, is distracting me, she doesn't do anything. But when he tells her I do something, she yells at me, and it's not really fair. That's why I hardly don't ever come to school, because he's really annoying and she always puts him in the same group as me. That's why I didn't come yesterday, even though I could. It makes me feel so angry that she doesn't do anything. I get all the blame all the time, and then I don't do my work. I don't like my teacher." So, in understanding that, it begged the question, why, how, and under what circumstances do disadvantaged students avoid or engage in classroom reading activities? We adopted the person in context perspective, as Clarence mentioned, and this allowed us to view what was going on for the students, but in terms of not only their behaviours, but the pedagogy that may have been contributing to these behaviours, the curriculum, resourcing in the classroom, and of course the teachers' classroom behaviours and how that impacted the students. So in terms of pedagogy, what we found was that there was a lot of chalk and talk going on in the classroom. The teacher was predominantly standing up at the front of the room. The students were sedentary, sitting at their desks, and there was little movement. And the teacher was basically filling these empty vessels with knowledge. There was little interaction or opportunity for conversation, either between students and teacher or amongst students. In terms of the curriculum, we found a very one-size-fits-all approach. In Queensland, the Education Department has created a document called the C2C, the Curriculum to Classroom. And if you like, it's been adopted as a bit of a recipe or formula for lessons and units of work in the schools that we were working in. And so what we found was that there was very little differentiation, and very much, as I said, following a recipe in order to deliver classroom content. And this was problematic because a lot of the content didn't relate to these students who were often coming from non-English speaking backgrounds. In one school, a high proportion were newly arrived immigrants to the country and had no English. And so the teachers weren't actually adapting the content and making it relevant to these particular students. There was no opportunity for conversations and connection to their prior knowledge. There was very little student choice given. So the rigidity with which the C2C documents were implemented was very problematic in that regard. And there were very few real examples of differentiation. In terms of resourcing, we saw that there was a problem around the quality of books. Many of the books were very old, and consequently the graphics or illustrations in them were dated and not particularly relevant to a very digital savvy audience. The relevance and interest of the books for students was something that the students continually raised, that they didn't like what they were being given to read, that they found the texts boring. There was very limited access for these students to other texts. So in the main, we saw books was the primary text type used. And so there was an obvious absence of things like newspapers, magazines, industrial print texts and digital texts. And library time appeared to be, even though plotted onto the calendar for the week, the classroom timetable, most of the time the students weren't being taken to the library. And in those cases where they were, it was often a time when games prevailed over books. The students would run around the bookshelves, playing hide and seek, and the teacher would be wandering around and often not engaging with the students in finding texts that might suit them. And in terms of teacher behaviours, what we saw was often the teachers were engaging in their own use of technology. So we saw many instances of teachers on iPads and on their mobile devices and texting for personal reasons. We saw the use of the computer for lesson planning, but it was during teaching time. So the teachers were in fact setting the students work to do and expecting them to do it independently, and then the teachers were removing themselves, sitting at the front of the room and working on their own tasks. There were negative discourses and attitudes frequently expressed. The way the teachers spoke to the students was quite problematic and quite condescending. In one instance, a teacher actually said, was talking about Canberra. The lesson was around the Australian government, and she was talking about the parliament being located in Canberra and that it was a wonderful place to visit, but perhaps you should leave going there until you're a little bit older because it's very interesting and little brains, quote, can't cope with that sort of information. There was a lot of clock watching going on. So teachers would often walk into lessons right on time or a little late, and lessons were being finished early. Teachers were leaving the school immediately after the bell at the end of the day. And there was an over-reliance, we felt, on extrinsic motivation. In one classroom, we saw 5 different types of reward systems or punishment systems, I'm not sure which, but there were 5 in operation in any one day. So we felt that all of these things that we'd observed across these 4 domains were quite problematic, and considering the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers and what that espouses as a teacher's core skill set, we felt that these observations that we'd made of some of these teachers, their behaviours were tending towards being disengaged as opposed to the ideal. So just recapping then, teachers read lecture style notes from the C2C. There was no overt differentiation for students. There was a very traditional one-way pedagogy as opposed to it being student-centred, and very few strategies were adopted. Students were criticised, belittled and ignored. In one classroom, there was a student who fainted and the teacher was sitting at the back of the room, and he had no idea that this boy had, in the front row, fainted, and it was up to the teacher aide to remove that child from the classroom. We saw lots of instances of teachers involved in marking and writing reports during class time rather than working with students or alongside students. And often students would be asking questions and they were being ignored. There was little or no student feedback given. Assessment was often contrived. In one case, in the case of the teacher with teaching the information about the Australian Parliament, the lesson was put up, projected onto an interactive whiteboard, and the students had the little test booklet in front of them. So the lesson was being taught and they were being asked to fill out their test booklet at the same time. And as I've already mentioned, the use of technology was apparent rather than physically being present and teaching. When it came to the causes, some of the teachers that we spoke with were quite happy to tell us what was going on for them. Some had a range of personal priorities. Others expressed fatigue with teaching in the classroom, fatigue in terms of being in the school. Obviously, these are low SES schools, so some of them have, or all of them had quite high behavioural problems, and they were tired of dealing with those sorts of issues on a day-to-day basis. Some of them admitted to being bored. They'd been in the classroom for an extended period of time and had become a bit disillusioned with the profession. Several of the teachers commented to us that the parents don't care, so why should I? And finally, many of them expressed frustration with the system, that their professionalism wasn't allowed to flourish under the administrative regimes of their schools. So in conclusion, we question, as I said, the term disengagement. We're currently working on how we might further conceptualise the issue. Are there context-bound solutions? How might teachers best be supported to address the causes? The problems associated with teacher development or teaching practices, and do teachers need to be more accountable for their practice?
Thanks, Gina. Depressing story, isn't it? Lots of great teachers out there as well. And as Gina said when she first introduced her work, there's an acknowledgement that's been made that's very important about the culture and the context within which these observations are being reported. Okay, we've got a video now showing work that's been done very successfully in Australia in relation to the Close the Gap initiative with Indigenous children in math.
Sorry we couldn't be with you today. We're back in Australia. The distance is just too far and we had a lot of jobs to do. I'm Professor Elizabeth Warren from the Australian Catholic University, and I'm the director of the Roland Project, which we're going to share some of the results with you today. Beside me is Dr. Jodie Miller. She's a PhD student who worked on the project and is an early career researcher. Okay, so our presentation today focuses on the development of a theoretical model for effective learning and teaching for young students situated in disadvantaged context. The particular focus was on the engagement of these teachers and students in the learning of mathematics. We would like to affirm and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are gathering on and recognise their ongoing spiritual closeness to the land, seas and waterways. The three constructs that drove the teaching and learning of this project were representations, the graphs, diagrams, number lines, grids used to represent mathematical concepts, oral language, the language used when learning about these concepts, and engagement, the actions used to help students meaningfully engage in mathematical learning. 17 schools participated in Roland, and all schools had high Indigenous or ESL student cohorts, and they were all situated in low socioeconomic context. This diagram depicts the relationship between teaching and learning in these contexts. What students learn in the classroom is influenced by what is envisaged as the mathematics curriculum and how this curriculum is enacted in the classroom. Both the affective and cognitive domains impact on how this curriculum is enacted by the teachers and acquired by the students. With regard to the teachers, their confidence in teaching mathematics, the beliefs they hold about the capability of their students to learn mathematics, their knowledge of mathematics, and their knowledge of how to effectively teach mathematics, and their knowledge of the context in which they are teaching all impact on how they act their teaching. With regard to students' confidence in learning mathematics, their engagement in this learning, their prior knowledge of Western mathematics, their culture and home language all impact on how they acquire mathematical understanding. Our teachers in these contexts commonly exhibit the following characteristics. They have limited teaching experience, they have low confidence in teaching mathematics, they often feel isolated both culturally and contextually, they have low expectations for their students, and they have low mathematics content knowledge. Students in these contexts commonly exhibit the following characteristics. They have low confidence in their learning of mathematics, they have low understanding of the school context, they have limited prior experiences with Western mathematics and limited mathematical language. They're commonly ESL students. Thus, we considered that a measure of student engagement was effective learning and a measure of teacher engagement was effective teaching. And the professional learning model that drove the Roland project was cyclical, consisting of 4 distinct elements and builds on the theories of learning. First, there is a need to dialogue with someone who has a deep knowledge of mathematics, how to effectively teach mathematics, the difficulties students have when they're learning mathematics, and how to address these difficulties. This person works collaboratively with teachers to plan and implement classroom experiences and reflect on the effectiveness of these actions. Teachers and students reflect on the challenges that occur and changes that need to be made. The methodology consists of 3 components. It integrated decolonising methodologies and qualitative and quantitative methodologies. Teachers and principals participated in one-on-one interviews 3 times a year, and students participated in pre- and post-tests purposely designed and administrated by the researchers.
Hi, this is Jodie, and I'm going to take you through the data arising from the project, both from the student and the teacher perspective. These couple of pictures that we're showing you today are some of the beautiful children that we get to work with in the project. This table represents the student participants in the Roland project. In total, you can see that there was 1,738 students who completed both pre- and post-testing. The data in this table is split 3 ways. First, by year level. This is depicted by the F, which represents foundation. This is our first year of schooling in Australia. And then the 1, 2 and 3, which represents year 1, 2 and 3. The students are then split accordingly to the geographical locations in which they attend school. So whether it's a metropolitan school, a remote school, or a very remote school. Then the student data is split according to the student's ethnicity. So the NI in the table stands for non-Indigenous, the I stands for Indigenous, and ESL represents the students who have identified as having English as a second language. Paired t-tests were conducted to analyse the data. From these scores, we were able to establish if there was a significant difference between the pre- and post-tests. However, what we were really interested in was how significant this effect was. So we focused on measuring the effect sizes. There are 2 measures that we are reporting for you today. The first is the EDA squared score,
and these have been calculated for all the pre-tests to report the magnitude of the intervention's effect. These values for eta squared are 0.1 for a small effect, 0.6 for a moderate effect, and 0.14 for a large effect. The second is the third dot point I'd like you to look at today, which is Cohen's D. And Cohen suggests that when considering educational outcomes, an effect size of 0.2 is small, 0.5 is medium, and 0.8 is large. This data represents all students in all year levels. The highlighted sections represent the year in which the focused professional learning took place. So, for example, in 2010, the foundation teachers had professional learning. In 2011, the focus of the professional learning was in Year 1. I'd like to draw your attention to the three columns to the right of the table, the p-value, the eta squared score, and Cohen's D score. As you can see, all year levels had a statistically significant change in scores from pre to post test, and this is represented by their p-score. The eta square score demonstrates that there was large effect changes for all students, and Cohen's D is above 1 in many cases in the table, which demonstrates a very large effect. Due to the consistency of the results, it is conjectured that the program was sustainable across the years regardless of professional learning being conducted for that year level. Students' data were then clustered by school location. This table presents the results for all students across each year level, analysed accordingly to school location. So metropolitan, remote, and very remote. Regardless of geographical location, students made both statistically and educationally significant gains in mathematics, and you can see this in the D and eta squared scores. The data demonstrates that the effect was again large regardless of the location of the school across all year levels. Finally, we analysed the data in terms of students' ethnicity. Results from paired t-tests indicate that all ethnicity groups for all year levels made statistically significant gains, as evidenced by the p-score, and these gains had large effect sizes. The results further suggest that Indigenous students are now mapping onto non-Indigenous scores. Now we are going to report the teacher data from the project. Across the 4-year period, the sample comprised of 154 teachers, with over half located in metropolitan areas. Teachers were categorised as being inexperienced, so they taught between, it was either their first year teaching up to 2 years of teaching in classrooms. They were experienced, so they had taught 3 to 9 years of teaching, or they were very experienced, so we'd categorise that as teaching over 10 years. 55% of the teachers were inexperienced, with 85% of these teachers teaching in remote and very remote locations. A third of these inexperienced teachers were new graduates. The distribution of teachers across the 4-year levels was relatively consistent, with each year level, Foundation to Year 3, comprising approximately of 55% inexperienced teachers, 23% experienced teachers, and 22% very experienced teachers. On analysis of the teacher data, the largest theme to emerge from the interviews was the increase in teacher confidence. Additional major themes that emerged from the data was a deepening of teachers' understanding of mathematics, as well as having a positive shift in their ability to teach mathematics. So this is a shift in their pedagogical skills. Teachers reported that this enhanced their ability to cater for the diverse range of learners in their classrooms. They also reported that there was more effective use of their Indigenous education workers or teacher assistants in directly supporting student learning. If you have a look at your screen now, here are some of the teacher interview comments that represent 3 of the major areas that had been identified in the analysis of the teacher interview data. The first one is to do with self-confidence, and the teacher reported that Roland had made a massive difference to her confidence, and she's really excited about teaching mathematics. So this was 96% of teachers' comments. 92% of teachers reported that they had a change in their pedagogical approach to teaching mathematics. They felt that the professional learning gave them more strategies and activities to incorporate in their day-to-day repertoire. They found that this was a benefit both for themselves and their students. Additionally, they found that their mathematical content knowledge increased while undertaking professional learning. They became more familiar with mathematical terminology, and it provided a deepening of their understanding of particular concepts and how they relate to particular stages of students' learning. Not only were teachers able to comment on their benefits from the professional learning, but also of the benefits that were exhibited in their classrooms from the students' perspectives. They were able to see students making connections between mathematics and the real world. Particularly, as this first quote depicts, is how students began using mathematical language in their play. The second quote highlights a different perspective that teachers saw, and they were able to see their students working more independently in mathematics. And they felt that Rollum had been able to provide themselves with those skills, but also the students with the skills to engage in mathematics on a more independent level. Prior to this, teachers didn't feel that students were able to engage at an individual level with mathematics. Now I'm going to pass you back to Elizabeth, who is going to discuss the theoretical model that emerged from the Rollum project.
The results of Rollum indicate that as teachers build their capacity to teach mathematics, they progress through 5 stages, with each requiring different types of support. So I'd like to draw your attention to the first 2 parts of the diagram. In these first 2 parts, it shows that as the students became engaged in the learning process, teachers began to show interest in what was going on in the classroom. And as students started to demonstrate their learning, it heightened the teachers' engagement. They go hand in hand. Now, if you look at the third stage, which is the cognitive domain, when students started to be engaged, they started to demonstrate different learning styles. And as a result of this, teachers felt the need to change their pedagogical content knowledge. They need to make certain that they actually were starting to cater for each learning style. In the fourth stage, students started to make connections in mathematics in the real world. And as they did this, teachers had to start changing their content knowledge because all of a sudden they found that there were concepts that they needed to know to make these connections. And finally, as students engaged in higher cognitive levels of mathematics, it resulted in teachers holding higher expectations for students, which carried over to future teaching in these particular contexts by these particular teachers, but it took 5 stages for it to get to that stage.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to our presentation today. We apologise that we couldn't be there to join in the discussion. So here are our contact details if you wish to send us an email, if you have any questions about this presentation, or if you'd like some further information about the project. Additionally, the website's on the bottom of the screen if you'd like to go and have a look at the Rollum website. Thank you again, and we hope this sparks some interesting conversations for you all.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Jodie, and now call on Steve, who's, as I mentioned before, flown over from Arizona to act as discussant for the session so far.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, folks. It's a challenge to put your arms around these 4 projects, and I'm going to do my best to just begin a discussion. Hopefully it'll lead to comments and interactions with you and the panelists. First off, I think you get a glimpse of what's going on, a fairly new enterprise, the Learning Sciences Institute of Australia at Australian Catholic University. Certainly these are just some of the projects that are being done there, but my effort to discuss and respect the work that's being there is I've taken probably just a slice, and a pretty small slice. What I saw as common territory has to do with research on engagement. So I want to make a few comments about that. I'm told that if I push that. The notion of engagement, although I think legitimately each of these projects talked about engagement, emphasized in some cases interventions to improve, enhance, advance engagement. Due to time, of course, they didn't all sit back and give you their definition or theoretical perspective on engagement entirely. So I want to try to situate this from my perspective. Certainly, I think it was very evident that engagement's a multi-dimensional construct, influenced in a lot of cases by context. We've learned about engagement from a teacher perspective, engagement from a student perspective. I've recently spent some time, and probably some of you have too, if you're interested in the topic of engagement, reading the Handbook of Research on Student Engagement. I don't have any work in that. I don't see myself as an engagement researcher per se, but I very, very much care about engagement as a construct. The definition, after 39 chapters in that book, the authors came back at the end and sort of said, well, what is engagement? And this is what they left us with, and I want to use that as kind of a starting point to reflect upon the work that was done today. Reading to you, student engagement refers to the student's active participation in academic and co-curricular or school-related activities and commitment to educational goals and learning. Probably the operative notion there is this student participation, and certainly at various levels too. It's one thing to show up, it's another thing to get deep knowledge and to engage in materials. Engaged students find learning meaningful. So meaningful participation seem to be two really operative points here. And they're invested in their learning future. It is a multi-dimensional construct, and as we went through some of these presentations, some have emphasized the cognitive side, some emphasized the behavioral side, some both of that, and the final presentation, sort of the affective side too. Student engagement drives learning. I think we're in agreement on that. Requires energy and efforts, and affected by multiple contextual influences that can be achieved by all learners. So there's a definitional context, if you will. Next slide, please. Supposed to hit that, right? Not getting the next slide. There we go. There's the second slide. I've hit the green button several times. So this is an early attempt of my work around engagement, and I show it, one, because it's simple, and two, on the other hand, it highlights, even when trying to be simple, it can get fairly complex. So back in the early 2000s, I was doing some work on children's social skills, and the outcome of that work was really that we recognize that social skills really are academic enablers. And we learned along the path that children who were socially skillful, relatively speaking, exhibited higher levels of motivation. In turn, that motivation was seen as a precursor or a covariate with engagement and study skills, and ultimately generated work on the outcomes of achievement. Now, putting this on the screen, simply, we could have looked at Clarence's model, or we could have looked at the Rolla model. I'm sure they have various data around this. I think one of the reasons I put this here is the proximal characteristic of motivation. And in fact, a lot of researchers suggest that engagement is a behavioral manifestation of motivation. Again, I highlight it only because I think as we dig into this work and really try to make sense of it, we have to spend probably, and I would encourage the researchers to spend a little more energy around actually operationalizing that construct of engagement. And probably working hard to measure it. Not a simple task, mind you. Lots of people have put lots of energy into it and haven't accomplished it. So, I love to push the green button. There we go. So some general observations about these studies, if I could share with you. All four studies, I think, to their credit, were multi-year, longitudinal investigations with methods for listening to learners. That added tons of data, a lot of qualitative data in many cases. All four studies examined conditions and variables that contribute to the design, ultimately, of interventions, of instructional tactics to improve engagement and related psychosocial constructs. So, in my mind, I looked at their work and really see engagement was seen as really step one in many ways. Now, it wasn't always the first step, but ultimately, step one in the process of improving learning, improving an outcome that it was evidence that learning had occurred. All four papers focused on engagement, treated it pretty much as a process variable, not as an outcome variable. They didn't sit down saying, our goal is to increase engagement. Their goal was to increase some other variable, reading outcome, math outcome, transition to a work environment. Those were the outcomes of concern, but engagement was seen as a key process variable. Measurement of this key construct, such as engagement, is an area all the studies, in effect, downplayed. They didn't start out saying we're trying to, enhance how we measure engagement. They charged forward, though. There's room, I think, for improvement on the measurement side. Now, obviously, this is a pet peeve of mine because I spend a lot of energy trying to figure out how to measure constructs, and I'm fascinated by it. And from the best that I can tell, no one has got a corner on the market of measuring engagement. So it's an open area. I encourage many of you to invest time in it. So let me say a few more things here about each study, if I'm able to do so. Okay, so the Bartlett study, and although several people were involved in it, Brendan presented the work, comprehensive examination of transition to work and conditions that facilitated transition for a pretty difficult group of children, referred to as disengaged youth. Through multiple methods design, excellent illustration, I think, of some of the qualitative work that's been done. He illustrated with these Gestalt trees to examine staff and youth's viewpoints, which is really critical to understand an intervention. Engagement's characterized in this work as really multidimensional, or at least there are a number of indicators that engagement has reported. Boys Town, BT, social enterprise intervention, is really truly a promising practice that now is ready to be scaled up and for sustainable study. The presentation that Clarence did represents work of both him and Claire Wyatt-Smith and Brendan Bartlett as well, under the heading of Reading Motivation. Ambitious study, 3-year longitudinal study with multiple data collection methods. It's a little unclear to me how representative the case that he presented was, but take my hat off to him. It was ambitious work to really study that young man and how he went about his work. Described really as a multiple mixed methods design with lots of qualitative data featured in the presentation. The concentration was a key construct. Clarence used that term, motivation, concentration, and engagement. I would argue that they're different but highly related. Key construct measured on repeated occasions. I think this is a really interesting component related to attention and interest, and it's to me it's a little unclear exactly how it relates to engagement, but I'm not suggesting it's not. I think it's a great opportunity. At this point, this work is not being done at the Learning Sciences Institute, but I think it's a great opportunity to begin doing some work on physiological measures, dealing with interest and attention. As we get into these small N studies, I think they offer some really rich data sources to go forward with. So, excuse me. How does this work contribute to a model of reading that could be useful to guide and explain reading interventions? I think that's the big question I have. I'm intrigued by a lot of the work in it, but I think that's the next challenging area, and that's what we're often left with. What are the implications for both theory and practice? So, if I might push this and get so fortunate to move forward, we'll get another slide up here. Okay, so Gina, we got your slide up, BlackBerry study. The disengaged teachers study, if you will, and I know that the terminology is one that is a concern to some, not so much to me as I looked at this. I appreciate really the complexity of this work, and this is a study that featured the teacher-student interactions in the classroom. There's an appreciation, I think, for applicable theories and the multiple dimensionality of the construct of engagement in this work. It's very rich information about teaching and in some cases some poor teaching, mind you, but that's still part of hypothesis generating about what really matters and what's but limited by a lack of working model on what effective teaching is. Now, I know Gina has developed some of that, it just wasn't highlighted in the work. So situating that disengaged teacher in a strong working model of effective teaching, I think, would be really useful. So how does this work advance the development of a model of effective teaching and learning? And so that's, I think, a challenging point that will be dealt with. The last but not least point, thanks, Brendan, I appreciate that very much. is the study that you saw the video on by Elizabeth Warren and Jody Miller, and about math disengagement, or math engagement, if you will. I know when I saw their paper originally, it emphasized disengagement. I think their slide presentation was focused more on the engagement side. Probably of all the work, it's the most mature of the studies. It's been around longer. Rolam has been a project, I don't know exactly the starting point, but it's not a new intervention, and it's growing, and so quite mature. In some ways, it was apropos to end with it because it showed how these various threads of work on engagement and on the teacher and the student side, I think can help, if you stick with it and have a program of work, provide really useful information. And to me, one of the major points about that really had to do with the emphasis on the professional development and its contribution to learning. And it, again, pretty straightforward data presentations with focused on outcomes around mathematics with strong effect size. Measurement of achievement growth could be enhanced in this work. They use a pretty simple model of pre-post measures, and if we really want to understand growth, particularly measurement, would argue for 3 or 4 data points that we might want to look at. So I want to thank you and thank each of the presenters for sharing their work with me and allowing me to get into it. I hope it stimulates, I hope some of my comments stimulate some thoughts on your part, and that you'll take the opportunity to ask or make comments about this work. Thank you.